Hi, I'm Alicia.
And I'm Robin, and you're listening to Bowel Moments,
the podcast sharing real talk about the realities of IBD. Served on the rocks. This week we talked to Bianca Hernandez. Bianca was diagnosed with Crohn's disease in 2015, and we talked to her about how this disease changed all aspects of her family life. We talked to her about her work in the National Council of College Leaders and in advocating for laws like step therapy reform and Allie's Law. We talked to her about the perils of comparing your decisions and your disease with others. We talked to her about the shame that can come along with some of your decision making. We talked to her about communication within the IBD community that's Spanish speaking and how that could be improved, and so much more. We had such a great conversation. Cheers.
Hi guys, welcome to Bowel Moments. This is Robin.
Hey guys, this is Alicia, and we are so excited to be joined by Bianca Hernandez. Bianca, welcome to the show.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm excited to get to know you. Robin knows you, so I'm very excited to hear your story. But before we get to that, we are going to ask you the very unprofessional question of what are you drinking?
So I would usually tell you it's like a martini of some sort or a glass of wine. But today I have some good old water with some vitamin C because I have like a tick on my throat. But usually it's some great wine.
There is something going around here for people. Anyway, Robin, what about you?
I am also drinking water. Hydrate or dihydrate? Hydrate or dihydrate?
Yep. No, that's very, very true. And especially considering where you're at, you need to be hydrating. So it makes sense. I am drinking iced tea, but also gin and tonic with elderflower tonic in it too. So it's a little floral, a little tart. Next question for you is tell us your IBD story. What brought you into our community?
So what brought me into a community? So I actually today was just looking at a calendar as I was prepping some notes for our conversation. And it's wild to think. So I was diagnosed August 6, 2015. So to date, it would be about like 8 years. So it's been wild to just think I've been a patient part of this community for 8 years in the span of, I think back to what has happened in the past 8 years that has definitely shaped the individual that I am, but has also influenced my professional decisions, a lot of my friendships, and a lot of the way I think to date. I'll bring it back to when I was first diagnosed. So as most patients, I was experiencing some symptoms random. When I would use restroom, body stools, mucus. So after multiple tests, the irony of it all is I had for the first time ever, the weekend that I first experienced symptoms, I had beet hummus. And forever they were like, oh, it's the beet hummus. It's the beet hummus. I was like, don't think this is beet hummus. So fast forward, I was showing symptoms like June 2015. And on August 6th, I had an endoscopy and a colonoscopy that ultimately was not able to be completed because of the amount of inflammation. So that day I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. And then I remember getting home, my mom was like, this is your diagnosis. You have to basically like rethink how you're living your life. And I think for all of us, it was a shock because we just had no prior understanding of ulcerative colitis. I only knew one friend whose brother had Crohn's. And unfortunately, his journey was pretty devastating. I mean, he had had a few surgeries. He was always in the hospital. And when I always reflected back to everything I would hear about his story, it was always tragedy. And it was devastating. That was the word that I used. So that was the start of my junior year. So I would say the majority of my junior year, my parents really wanted to approach the diagnosis very holistic. So I was basically only on oral medications and holistic methods, right? So I was on the GAPS diet for about 3 months. So I was having bone broth, breakfast, lunch, and dinner for about 3 weeks. So much so that my mom would like come to school with like a container and make the broth at home. And it really changed our lives as a family. I have 2 siblings and my parents really, shout out to them because they really took it among themselves to just make sure that I had the best tools to succeed in just dealing with this. I shot from maybe like 110 pounds to like 80, 70 pounds. I was super skinny in high school. It was terrible. I was falling asleep in class. I'll never forget. I had a teacher who had to like call me out after class, like, what's going on? And bottom line, that conversation in school, it was very, very apparent that it was something that I was dealing with very internal. However, my day-to-day was filled with external symptoms, if you will. Like I was showing that I had this disease, but I wasn't talking about it either because it was so new to me. At that time, I will say I wasn't embarrassed because I was just trying to figure out like what was going on internally. And I didn't have time for the embarrassment yet. So much so that in school, one day I basically had an accident. I was a junior in high school. I think I had good friends. I was like well liked. And to me, it was one of these things from like night and day. I was having this total internal crisis, like, oh my gosh, what do I do? One day in school, went up to the bathroom and basically I got to the bathroom not in time. And I remember like sitting there feeling like, I cannot keep coming to school without this under control. So I had called my mom and I was like, we need to get a handle on this. Like, I don't know who to talk to. I don't know if to go to our teachers, go to the dean. I need to figure out a solution here. On the opposite side, I had at that time a very small support system of 2 girls that I had ended up meeting who also had ulcerative colitis. And as we kind of talked about our disease at large, they kind of expressed that, they were also dealing with some insecurities in the classroom that they just didn't know how to talk about. So the solution that came about after speaking to my parents was we were going to meet with the dean at school, and I was going to request private restroom access to be able to have a space in the classroom, not in the classroom, I apologize, in the school setting, where I basically could go at my need whenever I needed to use the restroom. And I could have in there an extra change of clothes. I could have wipes. I could have whatever I needed to be able to leave the restroom and just navigate the school day as a normal 16-year-old. So my dean was really receptive to it. And the way that we kind of approached that was we created, at the time it was an email, and I basically sent it to all my teachers, the only 6 that needed to know that I had this disease. It was impacting me in this way. And I was going to have an opportunity if I needed to. I would have an arrow and I would just give it to them and they would know I'm going to the private restroom, and I'd come back. When I came back and talked to some friends that I had from the UC community, they were like, that's amazing. How do we get it in our schools? So that kind of not even intentionally created this idea of something called the Go Free program. So what it basically was a purple arrow that students with inflammatory bowel disease had, and they gave it to their teachers, and their teachers would automatically know that this student has this disease and they could have the private restroom access. So I'm sure you guys know, but for the greater audience, every school has a private restroom. The private restroom can be utilized by teachers or staff, but overall, it's not the restroom that students would use. So what this allowed was for students to be able to have a private space to really deal with these issues however they saw fit. So bottom line is, to my disbelief, I ended up meeting with, I want to say, like 25 school administrators all across Miami-Dade County. I'm from Miami, code 305. And the response was shocking, I would say. So much so that some teachers were like, yeah, we have 12 students with IBD. Or, I've never heard of this. It was polar extremes of the spectrum. So basically I would go to schools. I made a contract. I made like a binder, a folder with all of these resources. And I basically provided it to them. And I was this advocate for a disease that I was starting to learn about. And I was somehow now impacting the way that they were addressing this disease in their school systems. So what came of it was the Go Free program was instilled in these school communities, a lot of them elementary schools, ranging all the way to high schools, parochial, public, private. And we were finding that more people just wanted to talk about it. More people had the disease and they just didn't know how to. They didn't know, like, who do I go to? Is this weird? It's like a pooping disease. How do we talk about this in a normal space? So my high school senior year was really dedicated to this at large. I really wanted to make sure that people understood what IBD was and how it was impacting people. So much to say, I graduate my senior year. Health-wise, I was doing okay. But I did end up staying in Miami for the first year of college. I went to a community college nearby, and that was November 2017. I ended up getting hospitalized with the neurovirus in conjunction with a really bad flare-up. I was there for a week, and I actually had gotten a call in hospital, very sick, that I had made the National Council of College Leaders. So it was kind of like a full circle moment, I think, for me to then take the opportunity to take this advocacy to the next level. And it was so ironic that I was in the hospital getting this news like, oh, yeah, it's still got to keep going. I'm not done with this advocacy yet. So in high school, I was very grateful to have a lot of friends who had the same privileges, is really the word I'd use growing up. We always had access to great doctors. We always had the means whenever we needed to access them regarding medication, regarding resources, regarding anything and everything that you could possibly need. And when I got to the NCCL, it really opened my eyes to see there's a lot of students, there's a lot of college kids that just don't have these means. And one of those I would say was the conversation of, a lot of students really internalizing the decisions made for their health and feeling like it wasn't the right one, or it was the right one at the moment, but they should have done X, Y, and Z before then. They should have chosen an oral medication instead of biologic, instead of immunotherapy. So we spent, at least I feel like the NCCL really taught me to not really take so hard a lot of my health decisions. Prior to the point of being in the hospital with the neurovirus, I had always felt like all of my decisions for my health were well made because I had my parents' support in it. But after being in the hospital, my disease escalated really quickly. And my disease had escalated to Crohn's, and I was having inflammation in areas where I'd never had it before. And the decision to jump on an immunotherapy was pretty quick. And I was actually put on probably the strongest biologic rather quickly without much time in between. And a big conversation in my head was always, was this the right decision for me? And in getting to the NCCL, I didn't feel alone in that anymore. I felt like, okay, there's a lot of kids who just feel like this too, but why are we so hard on ourselves? Like, we're all trying to just navigate this as we go. So overall, it was a wonderful time to really just feel well supported as a college kid and navigate those conversations of, we have this autoimmune disease that really impacts us in the most vulnerable ways. A lot of us are starting new relationships. A lot of us are meeting boys, going on dates. And it's like, do we bring that up? Do we not bring that up? How do we navigate this? It was a little challenging, but all in all to say, I really feel like it opened my eyes to everyone has a path. And this is probably a little bit more faith-based, if you will, but we all really have our own journey, and we have to feel confident in the decisions made for our own health, because we can't be looking at what this girl or this guy did. It's the right decision for you at the end of the day, and you will continue navigating your way through your journey as it makes sense.
Bianca, honestly, like, I have lots and lots of questions for you, but just like, how flippin' cool is it that you just were like, I'm going to take this thing that affected me and realize that it affects so many more people and make this into like an entire county-wide program? That is so, so cool. I love that.
Yeah, that was never the intention, right? Like, people always ask. So on the local level, we have something called Silver Night, and it was put up for a Silver Night Award. And I remember at the end of that, I won the award for an honorable mention, and people were like, this was such a great idea. And my response is always like, this was never supposed to be an idea. Like, this just originated because there was a need, because there was one girl, a friend of mine, who was like, I want this. I need access. And kind of now going back, I now work in public relations for healthcare system. And, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. I did a preceptorship and I fainted on my first birth. It was very eye-opening. And I remember leaving that birth, telling my mom, okay, I definitely can't be a doctor, but I want to help people. And after doing the Go Free program, it was very clear that this was the way I would help people. And, in being on the NCCL too, I feel like we had a very diverse group of students, but one of my key strengths in the group, I feel, maybe I can tap and chat with one of my NCCL fellow members, but I spoke Spanish. I was probably the only Spanish-speaking NCCL member. And I really had the responsibility of just making sure that the way that we communicated to every Caucasian patient in the United States of America was the same that we were communicating to U.S. Hispanic college students who had IBD, and making sure that equity and that health equity across the board in our collateral, on our website, on our social media platforms, it was very receptive to that audience as well. So overall, I really feel like misinformation is a huge thing that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But in the little ways that I've been able to kind of grow in my baby career, it's really been nice to do it in the Crohn's and colitis space as well.
I am going to ask you to back up just a teensy bit, because some people know what NCCL is and what that means, but can you define that? Can you talk about like, what is it and why were you getting involved with it?
So the NCCL, better known as the National Council of College Leaders, is a group that is put together by the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation in partnership with, I believe, a few other organizations, that brings together students at the collegiate level across the United States who are eager to advocate and spread awareness about inflammatory bowel disease at large, anywhere from ulcerative colitis to intermediate colitis to Crohn's disease. So when I was in college, in full transparency, I just felt like I was not done with spreading awareness about this disease. I had heard about the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. I was very involved at the local level, but I did know about it on the national level. And one thing that really drew my attention was advocacy. I didn't even know the full definition of it, but based on the page that existed on the foundation site, it felt like it drew to my heartstrings, and I wanted to be part of whatever they were doing. Step therapy reform is a legislative topic that is really present for a lot of healthcare organizations, a lot of nonprofit organizations. It impacts the way that individuals can access medication, basically ensuring that they fail cheaper medications before approving the more expensive medication. That's the very basic definition to provide. So I had experienced that as a patient. And I remember reading the advocacy website on the foundation and that being one of the top priorities, and thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to be in college for 4 years. And if I could do something good, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go on the Hill, share my story if I'm selected by this NCCL group, and hopefully it'll change the way that we approach this moving forward, because no kid should ever have to go through this again. So I was, to this day, very grateful to the foundation for selecting me as one of the members. But I believe when I was there was about 15 of us, maybe 18, from all across the United States. I, and along with one other person, were from Florida. And, to this day, some of my dear friends still are on the NCCL, probably more sentimental. My first day on the Hill, I had the privilege of going with a gentleman by the name of Ty Redler. Ty was a dear friend of mine, and Ty actually passed away about 1.5 years ago. And to this day, I mean, every day I open my computer, like I'll go on my morning walk, and for some reason, Ty comes into my head. And I think about, our work is still not done. I feel very passionate about the strides that still need to be made in the IBD space, and no person should ever have to question their access to care. That's the bottom line. So in short, the NCCL is a wonderful organization to be a part of. I feel that it gave me lifelong friendships. It gave me a great opportunity to meet wonderful individuals, also learn about our legislative system. My 7th grade US history did not do me well, but it was a wonderful opportunity to really bring at face value the understanding to some of the individuals in our nation who are making some pretty big decisions, really the impact that this disease has on people. Just by looking at Ty, he really was able to tell the story of the many ways that we deal with this on a day-to-day basis and the way it has impacts on our life.
And I know the NCCL does a number of different things, but they're very, very intimately involved in advocacy work, but also some education and different pieces like that. So it's a really cool opportunity if you're selected, because I know it is a competitive process. You have to be selected. Yep. So that's really awesome that you were able to be part of it. So you definitely got involved in step therapy reform. Talk a little bit about what that felt like, because I think, we've mentioned this in some of the other shows, but I think a lot of people are intimidated to go do advocacy work. I think they're intimidated to go on the Hill. They don't know what to say. They're afraid that people won't listen. So talk a little bit about what that was like and how you've helped other people be more prepared to go do things like Hill Days.
So I'll start by saying I had the opportunity of being the advocacy chair on the NCCL, but having a title of anything having to do with advocacy doesn't matter. Anybody can be an advocate. It really just matters that you have an understanding of what you're advocating for and that you can properly convey your story in a way that is meaningful and impactful. So across the board, there is definitely a need for advocacy because at the end of the day, an organization like the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation really relies heavily on the stories of the stakeholders that they're representing. So much so pediatrics, but also adult patients. And I think sometimes there's misinformation that maybe pediatric stories aren't important or adult stories aren't important. That's all bullshit. They're both equally as important because of the way that these legislative laws impact both kinds of patients. So for instance, truthfully, when we're looking at donors, the stories that really drive home are pediatric stories. But at the end of the day, the demographic of patients, I'd probably say 85 to 90% of them that are really dealing with these step therapy reform issues are adult patients. So going on the Hill is as simple as putting together a paragraph of why this bill matters to you and sharing it and being the face to the issue. Because people sometimes lose that human understanding of, a lot of these people in these insurance companies are just seeing cases roll by their desks. And when you put a human face behind it, it does so much more. So, my 2 cents on the advocacy topic, I spent a year on it on the NCCL, and I continue to. Truthfully, I could always be doing more. This year, I haven't been as involved, but the bottom line is our stories really matter, especially for, I think, the generations of IBD patients to come. And I don't ever want to think back to what I dealt with in regards to accessing medication when I was in the hospital. And I was told this is the one you got to get on, as opposed to the question at play being, is this the right medication for you to be on? And I always feel that, and going back to, our journeys all being different. Yeah, well, we should then look at what does each journey consist of? What does each patient need? At the end of the day, the quality of life aspect needs to be the first thing that comes into question.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think, like you said, sometimes just putting a face to these issues, to the legislators or to the insurance companies is the piece that needs to push it forward, because it is that, everything boils down to money at the end of the day. And so, it's how does it look on paper financially, but you forget all of the human lives attached to those dollar figures of what that means. So I think it's really important that people share their stories. I'm 100% with you. I love that. So I'm going to keep you on advocacy for a little while longer. And then I want to revisit your comment about kind of comparing your story, comparing your decisions to others. But let's stay with advocacy for just a minute longer. One of the other bills that you worked on that is super important to our community is Allie's Law. So can you talk about that, please? Tell us what Allie's Law is and sort of what you did with this.
So I'll start with the fact that I never knew Allie's Law existed until I did the Go Free program. And then years later on the NCCL, I got to meet Allie. So Allie was actually a previous National Council of College Leaders member. And we together, it was myself, Allie, and a wonderful friend of ours, Scotty Gringos, that we were part of this video series kind of explaining to the public why Ali's Law was available, important, and mattered. So in short, Ali's Law is the first restroom access law that was passed in 2005. And basically what it does is ensure that individuals with specific medical conditions, not only inflammatory bowel disease, have access to the employee-only restrooms in a public setting. So for instance, not thinking about the Go Free program that I worked on, for an individual who had ulcerative colitis and was newly diagnosed, if they had an emergency and they walked into the mall, they have access to the restroom within each store. If you want to walk into a Hollister, every store in a mall has a bathroom. You have access to it. So it was basically the first law that really instilled the importance of, in my opinion, it was the first one that I had ever heard of that was really implementing health equity for all IBD patients, aside from IBD, right? So you didn't even have to be an IBD patient to have Ali's Law. Ali is an IBD patient. So that's kind of how the origin of it all started. Overall, I mean, I personally, it's impacted me. It's impacted me since I was first diagnosed. I used to have accidents all the time. I'll be the first one to admit it. Super embarrassing. But for individuals who don't need to have accidents and you're in a public space, it's a great opportunity to just walk in somewhere, show the card, which is the I can't wait card. And it's basically a result of Ali's Law. You basically show it to individuals in stores and then you can walk in. As an individual with inflammatory bowel disease, I will say, in full transparency, everything can always be a bit better constructed. The issue with Ali's Law today is that a lot of people don't even know what Ali's Law is. So for instance, if you were to walk into a store, like I have before, into a Hollister and show the individual behind the desk your card, they would probably look at you and be like, what the hell is that? You made that at home. That's like not a real thing. It's happened to me before. And I leave all frustrated and I'm like, they don't even understand what's going on. That is super frustrating as a patient. So advocating for something like Ali's Law really makes it a lot more visible, hopefully, in my opinion, but also just continues to allow patients this access. So for instance, it's not allowed in Florida. I've never been able to do it in Florida. It happened to be when I walked into a store in New York and I had poop running down my leg. Terrible. But it happens more often than not. And the reason that we need to advocate harder for Ali's Law is just make more individuals truthfully aware that it exists.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you're right. Unfortunately, I feel like there's a lot of people that don't really understand this unless they have a connection to inflammatory bowel disease. And then it seems like they probably do have a better understanding. I do want to spend a little bit of time here because one of the things you mentioned in the beginning of your story and kind of a couple of times in between is just this penchant for folks to compare their stories to other people's stories and compare their decisions to other people's decisions. And I think this is just natural for us all to do this. But what you said is, I think, really important for people to understand and for us to discuss is that, your healthcare decisions were made at the time of your healthcare decisions and aren't necessarily, you can't compare what you did versus somebody else's because your symptoms are different, your circumstances are different. And so I do think that's something that happens a lot. Tell me a little bit about kind of why this came up as a topic amongst you and your other friends at National Council of College Leaders. And also, what's some way that people can sort of stop that? Because I think if people just naturally kind of go, gosh, if I would have done something different, this would be different. Ideas on how people don't think that way. Feel free to save the world, Bianca.
Yeah, I wish. So for me, it really originated with that week that I was in the hospital. So after that hospital visit, what ended up happening for myself was I got to a space which had never occurred before in which I needed more. I had come to a point where I was no longer in control and the inflammation had gotten so severe that I actually was not even considered anymore an ulcerative colitis patient. I was looking to be more of a Crohn's patient. So the issue was, at the time I was still seeing a pediatric and an adult gastroenterologist. And in the time for approvals to get put on, at the time I was going to get put on Entyvio, my disease was progressing so much. And there was so much back and forth with step therapy reform and not being able to approve my medication in time that my disease had escalated so much and my calprotectin was so high. Calprotectin is the level of inflammation, for those of you who don't know. And basically, I, at that point, needed a stronger medication. So I was then put on Remicade. So it was kind of almost put on me. I didn't even have a decision at that point, which I really held on to because I didn't have a say. And that was hard, letting go of that control. So when I had joined the National Council of College Leaders, it was the first time that I was sitting in a room with more than 10 individuals who were my age, who all had the disease. And we were all talking about a thing that was so close to our hearts and we were so used to it, but I had never experienced so much transparency with the topic. So I remember a lot of us sitting around the room just talking about like, oh, I hate that I'm on Remicade because I can't go back to it. Or I hate that I used it so young in my life because now what happens if things get complicated in 10 years? And I think just listening and sitting in the silence of that was so scary for me. I remembered feeling like, oh my gosh, my options, what are my options now? I got forced to be on this, and now I don't know what does 10 years down the line look like. And a lot of individuals on the NCCL at that time had J pouches, or they had stomas or ostomies. And I remember being really overwhelmed. And one of my dear friends had made a comment of, we all can't sit here and point to each other and say, that's what you needed, because it sucks to hear that. It sucks to hear that, but it's the truth. It's what you needed at that moment. And we almost have to just sit with that uncomfortableness of, I needed that in that moment. I can't go back in time, but I can control what is today. And now at going to be 24 years old, there's many moments where I'll be by myself and I'll just get worked up and be like, oh my gosh, was that the right decision? What about my fertility? What about my future? What about my choices? And I'll get worked up still to this day. And I always bring myself back to the same thought of, I could have done what Emma did and been on a diet and not chosen any medications. Or I could have chosen the surgery like my friend Anna. I could have done all those different things, but there's a reason I didn't, because at that time in that place, I made a decision and it's worked for me to this day. Thankfully, I'm in endoscopic remission and it's worked beautifully. I'm on Remicade. I've been every 8 weeks. I get infusions. And, is there a day where I hope I could throw the medication out the window and just say, I'm going to live a super holistic life? Yes. But is that realistic based on my diagnosis? No. So I think as an IBD patient, it's a frustrating thing to sit with. It's probably the most frustrating thing I sit with on a personal note. But if I sat and just thought of every other option that I could have had, I'm just never going to be content with my life. So I choose to look on the bright side and say, thank you, God, for 8 wonderful years of health, lots of lessons, and the opportunity to have a normal life. And I'm able to go on dates with my boyfriend and eat really yummy food and go on vacation and not have to worry about having stomach pain. So it works for me right now. So if I had any piece of advice to try not to do that, it's to focus on what does work. And it's very possible that right now, nothing works. It's possible. It happened to me. There was many days where I woke up and I was on prednisone, super chunky, full moon face. And I remember being like, what am I going to do today? How am I going to feel better? And I made a plan. I found what worked for me. It was working out. It was going on walks, and it was eating really healthy foods, and it got better. So focus on the little things that bring you joy. Focus on the moments in your life that I think you can stand with and say, that worked for me, and thank God it did. That's it.
The mom in me wants to chime in here and just say, all we can ever do is make the best decisions we can with the information that we have available to us. And then when we have new information, then we take in that information and we make new decisions based on that information that we have available to us. And that cycle just continues. When we have a new information, we make new decisions based on that information that we have available to us. And that is just true with this disease too, because I'm 23, 24 years in, and I found myself in that situation in just the past few years, right? Making new decisions based on the new information that had presented itself to me. So it's really all we can ever do is make new decisions based on the information that we have available to us. But as human beings, we tend to do that. We tend to look at what is someone else doing and how is it working for them. It makes us feel less alone, but also angry that it's not working for us, or sad that it is working for us and not for them, or like guilty that it's working for us and not for someone else. You could play that game all day long and beat yourself up or be jealous or angry at someone else. It's really a fine line.
You touched on something, that the emotion, right? We haven't even talked about that, but I, by nature, am a emotional beast. I cry if someone pinches my arm. I cry if you tell me my hair looks bad. I cry. And again, that's an exaggeration, but it's not. I really feel, and since I've been diagnosed, I feel even more. And my parents have been, I can cry now. My parents have been incredible advocates for myself. And they were the prime example for individuals who were really advocating for me when I didn't have a voice, or my voice wasn't able to be used. So to your point, there's no perfect decision. It's really just riding the waves and just making sure that you're navigating the storms as best as possible. But I will say my mantra in all things is you got to feel it. There were so many moments in the NCCL. I'm like, have you cried? Have you cried about this? Have you allowed yourself to really get in the body of that emotion and just think to yourself, I'm really upset. I'm really frustrated. This is not the way that I wanted this to go. I'm such a planner and it fell off the side and it's now not part of the plan that I was thinking of. You need to feel it in whatever way it is. If it's punching a bag, if it's crying it out, if it's going on a run, it's the only way that we're able to really own in that experience and just make sure that, okay, I wiped out the tears. Tomorrow's a new day and we're going to tackle it as best as we can. That's it.
I say that too.
You need to.
That whole time. I also give depending on what it is, I think that maybe even Logan and Bailey might have mentioned this on their episode. I set time limits for feeling emotions too, depending on how crazy they are, because I don't want to spiral, right? Because I mean, if you are an emotional person and you feel things deeply, or if you're like a super empathetic person and you feel other people's emotions or take on their energy, sometimes it can be too much. And so I set time limits like, okay, I'm really angry about this, but really, how much of my energy does this deserve? Does this deserve a day of anger or 30 minutes of anger? Or does this deserve a day of sadness or an hour and a half of sadness? Like, how much time do I really want to give this thing? How much power over me do I really want to give this thing before I just, put on my big girl pants and move on with my life? So I also allow myself to feel things, but then I set parameters for it. To just say, I'm going to be mad about this for a whole week, but then I'm going to move on.
I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing though, Robin, because you're right. Unfortunately, you can get so mired in an emotion that you really just can't talk yourself out of it anymore. And like that spiral, you just start spiraling down, and it becomes part of you and not necessarily a thing that happened. And so I think it's not necessarily a bad advice. I don't know. I think that what's important about this is that, like, as we've talked about on the show, like nobody's IBD is the same. Like, you both have Crohn's disease, but like Robin's Crohn's disease was entirely different than Bianca's Crohn's disease. And so, even though Robin may have made some choices that were different than you, it doesn't mean that her choices were better than your choices. It's just all the constellation of everything that went into being Robin with Robin's Crohn's disease. And so it is easy to compare yourself to people, but it's incredibly difficult for that to be a true comparison, because it's just, there is none. There isn't a true comparison just because of, all of these factors, the types of disease, like types of the disease activities, the support team around you, the medical team around you, where you are, what access to good food you have, what access to information you have, like all of these things that play into it. So I think it's easy and hard all at the same time, but it's also a little bit dangerous to start doing that. Because like you said, there can be some real shame that goes into this. But I also don't want to minimize it and say, well, just don't do it, because that's also trite and not helpful. It's okay to grieve what you felt like may not have been the best decision. It's okay to grieve that your life isn't the way you want it to be at that moment, or that your disease has progressed, or the diet you tried didn't work the way you wanted it to, these types of things. And you sort of, process that emotion and grieve and let yourself do that. And then sort of figure out, how do you move on? How do you pull yourself out of that? So we got into a whole conversation about grief with one of our guests recently, and it was interesting. It was powerful. It's a good reminder that, like, there is grief associated with living with a chronic illness, and that it comes and goes, and it's a wheel that you get on and off as you progress throughout your life. So
it's an important one. I wasn't diagnosed as a pediatric patient, but a lot of my friends work at Camp Oasis, and a few other different camps, Camp Bog Creek, for patients who are diagnosed at a young age and just have had this diagnosis as part of their life. How could you not tap into that emotion? It's normal. It's really normal, and you'd be human not to,
For sure. I want to ask you about, because I think you're our first Spanish speaking guest, Robin.
¿Quieres hablar un poco de español?
Well, I speak a tiny amount.
No idea what. Are you like? I have no idea what you just said.
I do know what you said, but
okay.
I that's about, you've reached the extent of my Spanish recollections.
So. Totally fine. There'd be a Spanish speaker who'd probably be like, her Spanish is not that good, but I can get by.
Is Sean a Spanish speaker? Is Sean a Spanish
Oh,
speaker?
yeah. Sean Luna speaks Spanish. So, okay. So second one, you're the first female guest. How about that? As you were working with the NCCL to make sure that the information you were providing for English speaking folks was also going to be translatable for Spanish speaking folks, like, what was your part in that?
So total loaded question, which is that Spanish was a priority in regards to the only other language that we developed collateral for the foundation. So our head of the NCCL at the time, I think she still is, not too sure, spoke Spanish as well. And one of my most persistent messages all the time was, this is great. This education resource is wonderful, but you're only reaching one type of individual. We have wonderful individuals who contribute high-level insights, high-level metrics on some of the most important clinical trials and academic papers to date that could really help patients, but you're not allowing for the opportunity to reach individuals who speak a multitude of languages, because on the flip side, I was also working with another education organization who specialized in IBD resources. And there was a lot of different resources in all different languages that was being accessed on a day-to-day basis that had significant reach. So in going back to looking at just the Spanish language, so I previously worked in the Latin American market, and it really opened my eyes to, I'm a Cuban American. My parents were born in the United States. My grandparents were all born in Cuba. So in working in Latin America, it was pretty eye-opening to see Spanish is universal, right? Individuals speak all different types of Spanish, but there's a Colombian Spanish, there is an Argentinian Spanish, there's a Cuban Spanish that is very different all across the different countries. So in making sure that we were developing one piece of Spanish collateral, let's just say, we needed to make sure that that Spanish collateral was going to be receptive to people in all those different countries of all those different origins. And we were missing that mark, I believed. And truthfully, like any organization, I don't think at the time there was a lot of ability to work on that. And I don't think it was priority. But I mean, it's a passion point for myself. I was always, to this day, I think I supported on a Hispanic Heritage video. I do think that the ability to reach all individuals who speak all different types of languages should always be priority. So that's my 2 cents to that very loaded question. I do think, at the end of the day, my Spanish isn't wonderful, but a little Spanish is better than no Spanish, in my opinion. Granted, you need to get someone who understands the language and is not going to butcher it. For instance, I'll give you a perfect example. Breast cancer in English is breast cancer. In Spanish, the translation exact would be seno cáncer, breast cancer. But that's not the way you say it in Spanish. It's cáncer del seno, cancer of the breast. So the translation, if you wanted to make it exact, which is many of the times what happened in foundation, they take an English piece and just directly translate it to Spanish. A human can't receive that. It just doesn't make any sense. So the bottom line is, if you're going to do something, you got to execute well. And you had a person, and maybe this is just PSA to all organizations, make sure that you have the right people who can best work on materials like that make sense for the organization to succeed. At the end of the day, the last thing you would need is to develop a collateral piece that just was not going to be receptive towards your Hispanic audiences.
That is very fair feedback.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And it expands past just Hispanic, right? Because, to date, I work for a healthcare organization and my priority is brain and spine and cancer. We do it all the time. The American Cancer Society puts together every year incredible metrics, 2023 metrics, and it is organized by disease sites, right? Each of those disease sites have a different language. So prostate cancer is very different than the language you'd provide for breast cancer. There's individuals who proofread that when it's changed to Spanish, when it's changed to French, when it's changed to Dutch, when it's changed to Italian. The same should go for any organization like the foundation, like ACN, like any other organization that's communicating health information to key publics. Super important. So 2 cents, saying it far and wide so everybody can hear, is if you're going to export out any type of information that should be for education purposes, you got to make sure the education is legible.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really, really important point. And I think the other thing is that there are, Google Translate type programs, things like that. But even especially, you might want to consider also looking at like medical translation specifically, because just because somebody speaks Spanish doesn't mean they necessarily know the words that are the correct words in the medical vernacular of that country, of that language. Because I know there's some differences, like you said, of like you say it cancer day something, obviously not with my accent, and instead of, breast cancer, that kind of thing. So it's, like that's a really important distinction to make. And just because somebody is a Spanish translator doesn't necessarily mean they may know it. It's just like there are people that, that's the whole job of being a medical translator, is people that are specially trained to understand medical terms and to be able to say those terms back to the person who English is not their first language, so that they truly understand it. So I think it's a really, really good distinction. Since you're saving the world here in multiple ways, I'm curious about, as other people approach things like education or things like just awareness building in different countries, because like, I guess I'm thinking of, and I'm going to qualify this, but like looking at something like SIAS, South Asian IBD Alliance, and Tina's work, and really part of what they're doing is raising the awareness that these diseases happen within this population that didn't seem like it was really happening, but also just helping the medical community understand how it is received in that community and how they might best help people within that community. I'm curious if you have any insights, just because, you are in communications and this is obviously a passion for you too. If there are insights like how things might be better communicated to people who speak Spanish as their first language or as their primary language instead of English. Like, because obviously it's hard to say like people of, Latinx descent, because again, you're talking about so many countries. So like, This feels like a really big
great
puzzle.
Question. So, I mean, probably from the start of my time on the NCCL to today, one of the major things that I hold near and dear is all things diversity. And one of the key challenges I think I always voiced was we as an organization, and we meaning the individuals who really advocate for the disease at large, through an organization that's just predominantly focused on this, we really don't spend too much time highlighting the prior medical diseases or issues that would later be cause for something a little bit more complicated. Perfect example. There's patients who have colon cancer. Okay. Colon cancer can be deadly if you don't catch it on time. The majority of patients, I would say and I have to keep my metrics correct on this, but I would say there's like 60 to 75% of colon cancer patients have a pre-existing condition within the stomach area, the majority of them being IBS or IBD. Let's take the metrics and look at it from a diversity and equity perspective. Black Americans are more likely to develop colon cancer. It's a statistic known fact. The majority of them just don't have access to conduct endoscopy and colonoscopy screenings to be able to catch colon cancer at the earliest of stages. It's also a subject for U.S. Hispanics because a lot of them don't have the means to transport to medical offices to be able to have these procedures done. It's just known, right? So why haven't we made the connection between IBD and these diseases that are really impacting our communities at large, killing a lot of individuals? So I have always felt like it's really our responsibility as conscious communicators to connect the two. Like, okay, if you could have colon cancer one day and be more susceptible to it, let's make sure we look at everything else prior to eliminate your chances as best as we can. Wouldn't one of those main avenues, knowing the subject matter of IBD that we know so well, wouldn't we communicate that to those key publics effectively? That would just make the most sense to me as a conscious communicator. Maybe I'm wrong. I have no idea. But the bottom line is we should definitely work to address the key publics that are most susceptible to having IBD. Like in Tina's case, love Tina very much. The demographic that she so passionately advocates for is most susceptible to IBD, to my understanding. If I'm not, memory serves me correct. They have a very high chance of developing IBD. I want to say it's Crohn's, not ulcerative colitis. U.S. Hispanics are more prone to ulcerative colitis rather than Crohn's. I don't know about Black Americans, but I'd have to double check on that. The bottom line is there's no direct communications that I've been aware of that we really take time to like address those individuals in the way that they receive information. So looking at the key demographic, US Hispanics, how do they best receive information? They do via their cell phones. They usually are listening a lot to digital platforms like Telemundo 24/7, which is basically their streaming service, or Univision 24/7. These are the ways that they best receive information. A lot of them are also on social media. So what it would take is for potentially putting a gastroenterologist on once a week to talk about the importance of making sure that you are eating healthy, making sure that if you have signs and symptoms, you go to a doctor, finding the way that these individuals best receive information and communicating with them directly. That's what I would do as a conscious communicator.
I do think that's interesting insight to say, like, how do we get somebody who's really going to resonate with that audience? Like, a doctor that is bilingual, that can answer questions in English or Spanish, depending on what the person is looking for. Somebody who, feels like they're more integrated into the community, I think it would definitely make a lot of sense to have in some of these places, and just really normalizing the conversation around this. Just like, hey, this is something you just need to know. Just like, that road has a stop in it or something, like it's just part of what's information that should be shared in these communities. So I really like that idea. Now I'm like, should we develop a Spanish podcast?
No, but like, for instance, if you would want, so total shout out, but my adult gastroenterologist is Dr. Maria Brew. I think she's one of the most wonderful human beings on the planet. She's a Sherman Prize winner. She knows IBD like the back of her hand. She speaks Spanish beautifully, super eloquent. I don't know. The best part about it is she really sees a lot of patients on the international stage because Miami is such a hub for a lot of our international patients. So a lot of patients from Latin America come to her for a first opinion. And I would say a lot of Latin American patients, when they get to her, are at a pretty severe stage of their diagnosis because they don't have access to getting a colonoscopy when they were first having signs and symptoms, but they've had it now, bloody stools, for 3 years, and they just decided that they wanted to come and see a specialist because that can't be normal. So it's also the proactiveness, right? Like understanding what is normal and what is not normal. We live in the United States where if you cut your arm, you're like, oh my gosh, I need a tetanus shot immediately. I cannot get this infected. There's also not a level, I don't think, unfortunately, and it's the nature of the beast. I don't think for these countries that really just don't have the means to quality healthcare, someone would probably say that the United States doesn't have quality healthcare, but that's a different conversation, is prioritizing what is normal and what is not normal. I knew 2 weeks into having bloody stools, it wasn't normal. And I needed to figure out what was going on with my overall health. And I was 15 years old. So To answer your first question, that is the message I always communicate. What are real signs and symptoms, and when do you need to see a doctor? And knowing what is normal and what is not normal. And amplifying that, in the United States, it's super important, but even past the United States, it should be a greater conversation because people shouldn't be dying from IBD. It's an unfortunate cause and it shouldn't be existing.
And on that note, we told you at the beginning that the hour goes fast, and it is time for me to ask you the last question. What is the one piece of advice you want to leave our listeners with, Bianca?
This has been a lot of fun. I wish we could stay for 2 more hours. Thank you so much for the invite. I would say your diagnosis is not a devastation. And I really held on to that when I was first diagnosed, and it sucked just because I felt like there was no answers. I was really alone. It sounded scary, but 8 years out, this diagnosis has been one of the greatest blessings in my life. It has brought me endless friendships. It's taught me a different level of resilience that I never knew I had within me. It's taught me a lot about perseverance, a lot about the importance of advocating for yourself that has now played into my professional and my personal career. And most importantly, prioritizing what is right for you. So to answer your question, all those things. Thank you so much, guys. It's been such a blast chatting with you tonight.
I love that your diagnosis is not devastation. That's an amazing way to end the show. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yes, Bianca, it was such a pleasure to talk to you. I totally understand why Robin wanted you on the show. So thank you.
I think you guys rock.
So much for sharing your story with us and being so open and passionate and inspiring. So thank you. Thank you everyone else for listening, and cheers, guys.
Cheers, everybody.
Hi, everyone. This is Bianca. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, subscribe, and share it with your friends.